Everyone in that packed conference room froze the moment my termination was announced, not because they cared about me, but because of how brutally public it was. The CEO didn't even look up from his prepared statement as he read off the official reasons. Failure to communicate risks properly. Ineffective reporting. Poor departmental coordination. Every word was scripted, rehearsed, and designed to humiliate me. The board nodded along like obedient statues, pretending they hadn't approved every report I'd ever submitted. 30 seconds later, security was already waiting at the door. But as I stood there, staring at the same executives who had ignored every warning I'd given them over the past 8 months, I felt no panic, no fear, only a cold, sharp clarity. They thought firing me publicly would silence me. What they didn't know was that they had just fired the one person keeping their entire house of cards standing upright. And they had done it in front of witnesses. That was their first mistake. Their second was forgetting who I really was, not just a risk officer, but a former federal compliance analyst with a memory like a steel trap and a network of contacts they couldn't even imagine. As security escorted me out, I replayed every ignored warning in my head: the illegal data sharing arrangement with the vendor, the falsified ESG compliance metrics, the unreported security breach that had been quietly buried by the CIO. I had documented everything. Time-stamped. Cross-verified. Logged with my federal contacts the moment they ignored my escalation requests. They thought my silence was compliance. It wasn't. It was preparation. When the elevator doors closed and the guards pretended not to look at me, I finally let myself smile. Not out of anger or spite, but out of inevitability. The board had signed a termination they believed would save them politically. What they actually did was unleash the one person they should have kept close, the one person who knew exactly which threads would unravel the entire web they'd spun. I didn't go home. I went straight to an address only a few people in the city knew: the regional office of the Federal Corporate Integrity Division. Former colleagues greeted me like an old friend returning from war. They already knew something was off. They'd been tracking several inconsistencies in the company's filings, but they didn't have enough internal evidence to act. I did. And I dropped a USB drive onto the desk like it was a grenade. Inside it contained 9 months of internal audit logs, doctored risk assessments, emails showing deliberate non-disclosure to investors, and a 42-page memo detailing every regulation they had violated by ignoring my directives. The agents didn't say much. They didn't need to. The look they gave each other said everything. This isn't just a fine. This is a takedown. 3 weeks later, just as the company was preparing its annual shareholder event, the first hammer fell. Subpoenas hit the inboxes of every senior executive at 5:12 a.m. Employees poured into the lobby to find federal vehicles surrounding the building. News drones hovered overhead. The CEO's smirk, the same one he wore when he fired me, vanished when agents walked past security and straight into his office. They seized servers, financial records, private communications, even the CFO's tablet. The stock plummeted before noon. Investors demanded answers. The board tried to distance themselves, but my documentation told the truth. They had known, ignored, and signed off on everything. I didn't watch the chaos from afar. I watched it from a comfortable chair inside the federal headquarters, wearing a visitor badge, sipping coffee while reviewing the final draft of my whistleblower compensation agreement. You see, they had forgotten something very important: federal law protects whistleblowers, even ex-employees. Especially ex-employees who were fired in retaliation for doing their job correctly. Every report I had filed immediately after my termination created a legal shield around me so strong that even their high-powered lawyers couldn't crack it. Their attempt at erasing me had become the documentation of their demise. When the company was eventually forced into federal oversight, the CEO was removed, the CFO indicted, and the board dissolved. Investors recovered their losses from executive clawbacks. And the new leadership, appointed by regulators, reached out to me with an offer to return as chief compliance advisor. I declined. Not out of bitterness. Out of principle. Some places deserve to fall so something better can be built in their ashes. Instead, I accepted a federal consulting role, helping corporations avoid the exact kind of downfall that had consumed my former employer. Ironically, my firing had become the single greatest turning point of my career, not because I sought revenge, but because I refused to accept corruption disguised as leadership. They fired me publicly to shame me. But in the end, they exposed themselves. And I made sure corporate justice was delivered, cleanly, legally, and unmistakably. The silence in the boardroom wasn't normal. Not the tense, waiting for numbers kind of silence, this was the kind that swallowed oxygen. I felt it tightening around my ribs as I stood at the center of the long marble table, staring at the CEO who couldn't quite meet my eyes. Moments earlier, he'd fired me in front of 30 executives, claiming that my failure to approve a high-yield, low-risk investment strategy had cost the company millions. He said it loudly, theatrically, like a man performing for an invisible crowd. He wanted humiliation. He wanted a public execution. He wanted to show the others what happens when someone questions him. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been quietly working with federal agencies for months, documenting everything from his reckless trading to his backroom deals with a hedge fund under investigation. I wasn't just a risk officer anymore. I was a federal expert witness. And this performance he was giving? This would be Exhibit A. I didn't say a word as he escorted me out. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply picked up my briefcase, nodded once, and walked through the halls where people pretended not to stare. Let them think I lost. Let them think the CEO won. Because the truth was already in motion, and his downfall had been mathematically guaranteed long before he opened his mouth today. My departure wasn't an end. It was the final condition of a trigger plan I had architected with precision. A chain reaction was about to begin, and by morning, the company would wake up to the most brutal audit of its existence. The moment they fired me on that stage, in front of 300 employees in a live stream watched by thousands, I realized something chilling. They didn't want justice, they wanted a spectacle. The CEO's voice echoed through the auditorium, trembling with fake indignation as he accused me of creating unnecessary obstacles, slowing progress, and misinterpreting federal risk standards. People stared at me with a mix of confusion and fear, as if my 20 years of spotless compliance work had suddenly meant nothing. But as I stood there with the company badge still warm against my chest, I felt no panic. Because unlike them, I knew the truth. And more importantly, I knew the consequences, the federal consequences, of what they had done to hide their own fraud. And that's when I decided, if they wanted a public show, I would give them a finale they'd never forget. I walked out of that building without a single box in my hand. I didn't need my office plants or the stack of awards they'd given me the year before. What I carried instead were memories, spreadsheets I'd memorized, discrepancies I'd flagged, conversations I'd documented, violations so severe they could melt through corporate walls. For months, the CEO and CFO had ignored every warning I gave them about their fast-track acquisition. They wanted growth records. They wanted headlines. They wanted bonuses. And they wanted me gone because my reports threatened their empire of fabricated numbers and illegal compliance shortcuts. They thought firing me publicly would humiliate me into silence. They forgot one thing: I wasn't just any risk officer. I was a former federal compliance architect, the kind of person who helped write the regulations they were breaking. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I opened the encrypted vault on my laptop. Everything I had recorded, every deleted message, every hidden transaction trail, every manipulated risk audit, was waiting. I didn't take anything from the company after being fired. I didn't have to. These were all documents I created as part of my job, all tied to my personal federal certification. Every word I wrote belonged to me under whistleblower protection. As I sifted through the files, I realized they hadn't just cut corners, they detonated whole staircases and pretended the building was still standing. They falsified acquisition debt, concealed foreign ownership conflicts, manipulated risk-weight assets, and ignored federal procurement protocols. This wasn't a risk gap. This was a corporate sinkhole. And they were about to fall straight into it. The next morning, I walked into the Federal Corporate Integrity Office, a place where my reputation still meant something, and handed over the full dossier. Not dramatic. Not vengeful. Just clinical, precise, devastating. The agents didn't even finish reading before they glanced at me with raised eyebrows. "They fired you publicly?" one asked. I nodded. "Good," he said. "That makes this easier." Within an hour, a federal task force was mobilized. Not a raid. Not yet. Something worse, a silent compliance hold. Every account frozen. Every acquisition paused. Every financial statement locked. Their entire machine, the one they built without me, stopped dead. Meanwhile, the company acted like nothing was wrong. They bragged online about moving past internal obstacles and embracing fearless innovation. But their investors weren't stupid. When funds suddenly halted and quarterly reports required additional verification, panic spread. By the time the employees realized something was wrong, the executives were already barricading themselves in boardrooms, desperately trying to explain gaps they didn't understand. And I simply waited, not out of malice, but because federal wheels turn slow, and when they turn, they grind. On the third day, my phone lit up with messages from former colleagues. Words like arrests, subpoenas, asset seizures, federal injunction flooded the screen. The CEO who humiliated me publicly was now the one being escorted publicly out of his office, cameras flashing, reporters shouting. The same auditorium where he fired me was now filled with agents collecting evidence and employees giving sworn statements. And I wasn't smiling. I wasn't celebrating. I was calm, because this wasn't revenge built on emotion. This was justice built on compliance. The justice they mocked until it swallowed them. The boardroom door closed behind me with a soft click, but the humiliation echoed louder than any slam. They hadn't just fired me, they fired me publicly. In front of the entire company. Cameras recording, employees whispering, executives smirking as if they'd finally tamed the one man who refused to bend. I was the chief risk officer, the guy who spent years protecting this corporation from the very disasters they kept trying to cause. My job wasn't to be liked. My job was to stop stupidity from bankrupting us. And that was exactly why they wanted me gone. The CEO, Brandon Hale, had been pushing through reckless expansion plans and conveniently ignoring my warnings. I told him the supply chain reports were falsified. I told him the investment vehicles his buddies pitched were beautifully wrapped grenades. I told him regulators were already circling, if not for the company then for him. He didn't like that. So, he staged my firing like a spectacle, a victory lap for a man too arrogant to see the storm inches from his nose. Cameras caught me walking out. Social media burned with the news. But what none of them knew, not the taunting executives, not the shareholders, and certainly not Brandon, was that I was no ordinary risk officer. I wasn't just a corporate watchdog. I was one of the federal government's contracted experts for high-level financial compliance and counter-fraud analysis. And the federal government did not appreciate their experts being humiliated on live streams. The moment I stepped outside the building, my phone buzzed. It was a federal contact. "We saw the video," he said calmly. You ready to finish what you started? I looked back at the skyscraper behind me, gleaming like a monument to corporate greed. The same building whose foundation I'd spent years holding together with compliance tape while its leadership tried their best to burn it down. If they wanted me gone, fine. But they were about to learn the most important rule in risk management: every reckless action has a calculated consequence. And I'd already started calculating theirs. The next morning, the office was drowning in a kind of tense silence you could feel in your teeth. People avoided looking at me, pretending to be deep in spreadsheets or copier jams, anything to avoid acknowledging the spectacle from the day before. I walked through the halls slowly, not out of defeat, but because I wanted to see it all clearly: the hollow ambition, the fear, the culture of silence that had allowed people like Aldrich to flourish unchecked. Every eye that darted away only confirmed what I already knew: I hadn't lost anything worth keeping. They had. I spent the day gathering what little I had left in my office: some papers, a few old reports, and a framed letter from the Federal Compliance Board thanking me for my service during an interstate investigation that had saved billions in taxpayer funds. Funny how fast a corporate title evaporates, but real authority, that stays with you. As I locked my office door for the last time, I got a text from someone I never expected: "Call me. It's urgent." It was Director Hughes from the Federal Oversight Commission. The message was short, but the meaning was enormous. I stepped outside into the afternoon air, hit call, and within seconds heard the familiar gravel in his voice. "I heard what happened," he said. "And I also heard what Aldrich has been hiding." My pulse slowed in that strange way it does when everything starts lining up. "How much do you know?" I asked. He let out a humorless laugh. "Enough to know you're walking out of the wrong building. Meet me at headquarters tomorrow." That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I spread out all the documents I'd secretly kept copies of. Not confidential files, those were off limits, but my own reports, analyses, and flagged transactions that I had elevated through proper channels, only to have them buried by executives who didn't want the truth interfering with their bonuses. I wasn't planning revenge out of spite. I was planning accountability. There's a difference, and it matters. When dawn broke, I dressed like I was heading to war: crisp suit, polished shoes, clean shave. Not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to look exactly like what I was: the person they never should have underestimated. At Federal Oversight Headquarters, Director Hughes greeted me with a thick folder and a grim expression. "We suspected irregularities for months," he said. "Your firing gave us the missing puzzle piece." I opened the folder. What stared back at me was worse than anything I had predicted: falsified risk assessments, backdated approvals, and millions funneled into off-book accounts disguised as international compliance initiatives. My former company wasn't just cutting corners. They were building an entire empire on lies, using my reputation as the shield to hide behind. For the first time since being fired, I felt something sharp and cold settle into place. Purpose. Not the kind you put on performance reviews. The kind that changes the fate of corporations. The kind that ruins the right people. But I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to do it cleanly, legally, and surgically, the kind of takedown that would leave the entire industry talking for decades. And I was only just getting started. The news cycle died down, but inside the company the atmosphere only grew heavier. Every hallway whisper felt like a countdown, every executive meeting like a courtroom where no one knew the charges yet. People avoided eye contact with upper management, and the board members who once strutted through the building suddenly looked like commuters waiting for a train that might not stop for them. They had no idea how deep the missing reports scandal truly went, but they sensed it. Fear has a scent, and it lingered in every conference room like stale air. A week later, another domino fell. The chief financial officer abruptly resigned, though everyone knew he was escorted out. His departure email was suspiciously short, full of corporate jargon and apologies for the inconvenience. Inconvenience. That was the word he chose for a potential federal charge that could put him behind bars for a decade. I read his email twice, then closed my laptop and laughed quietly. They were crumbling faster than even I predicted. But my work wasn't finished. I still had one last move, not revenge, not destruction, but proof. The kind of proof that no amount of money, lawyers, or media manipulation could bury. I'd spent years studying corporate risk patterns, federal enforcement gaps, compliance oversight failures. I knew exactly how companies like this hid their rot. And now I had the perfect audience to expose it to, the annual Global Risk and Integrity Summit, the same event that had once rejected my proposal for being too alarmist. This time, they invited me as keynote speaker. The night before the summit, as I reviewed my presentation, I realized something important. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. It wasn't even about justice. It was about prevention, making sure no one else went through what I endured. I wasn't just taking down a corrupt corporation, I was building a spotlight that would expose every organization like it. That realization settled over me like calm armor. Revenge rooted in purpose is sharper, cleaner, and far more devastating. When I stepped onto the massive stage the next morning, the lights were blinding, the cameras lined up like soldiers. Thousands of executives, regulators, auditors, and policymakers sat waiting. I began with the story, how I had been publicly fired for doing the job I was hired to do. How my warnings were mocked, my credibility attacked, my dedication dismissed. Then I revealed the truth, the missing reports, the concealed losses, the illegal risk transfers. Gasps echoed through the auditorium like falling dominoes. Some executives leaned forward, others stared at their shoes. Then I played the audio. Yes, the audio. The one none of them knew I had. The meeting where the CEO, CFO, and 2 board members discussed neutralizing my influence by eliminating my position and burying the risk data. Their voices crystal clear, their arrogance preserved forever. You could hear the oxygen leave the room when their words echoed across the giant speakers. By the time I finished, the summit wasn't a conference anymore, it was a funeral. Not mine. Theirs. Reporters swarmed me afterward. Regulators asked for copies. Senators requested briefings. And somewhere in the background, I knew the SEC was already drafting subpoenas. They fired me publicly. But I educated the world publicly. And when the cameras shut off and the crowd dispersed, I walked out of the building alone, calm, steady, unafraid, not because I had one, but because my purpose had outgrown revenge. They tried to silence a risk officer. They created a federal-level force instead. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness, as if the entire building sensed what was about to unfold. I walked through the lobby with nothing but a slim folder under my arm, nodding politely at the same executives who once whispered about how unstable I supposedly was. Not one of them could meet my eyes now. Word travels fast when federal authority is involved, even faster when the person you publicly humiliated turns out to be the only thing standing between your company and a criminal investigation. Their silence was satisfying, but I wasn't here for catharsis. I was here for accountability. For truth. For justice, corporate justice, the kind few people ever get to witness firsthand. Upstairs, behind the glossy glass doors of the executive suite, the board was gathered in full. The CEO sat rigidly, hands folded, trying to look confident but failing miserably. He'd been briefed, the federal expert coming today had questions. He didn't yet know the expert was me, or that I wasn't here to negotiate. I was here to expose. I entered the room with 2 federal auditors at my side, and the look on the CEO's face was the kind of moment people spend their whole lives hoping for. His jaw dropped, face draining to a ghostly pale, eyes darting as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. I placed the folder on the table and simply said, "You fired me for doing my job. Today I'll show you why that was the most expensive mistake you ever made." The room froze. Not a breath, not a shuffle, not even a cough. I opened the folder, revealing the preliminary assessment I'd compiled, a devastating, comprehensive breakdown of every compliance violation they thought they'd buried. It was all there: fraudulent risk disclosures, manipulated reports, concealed fines, and most damning of all, the CEO's direct approval on transactions that violated federal regulations. As I spoke, the board members flipped through the pages with trembling hands, realization dawning that they hadn't just fired a risk officer, they'd fired the only person keeping them from disaster. The CEO tried to interrupt, voice cracking, "This is exaggerated." One of the federal auditors shut him down instantly. "Sir, you will remain silent." I continued, laying out the entire timeline: when I first detected the anomalies, the warnings I issued, the reports I submitted, and finally, the day I was publicly terminated for insubordination. The same event the CEO had proudly live-streamed to the company as a victory for modern leadership. He loved the applause. He just never expected the recording to become Exhibit A in a federal obstruction case. Every detail I'd documented, every email I'd preserved, every time-stamped warning I'd sent was now a spear aimed directly at the heart of the empire he'd built on lies. By the time I finished, the boardroom was filled with a suffocating silence. The auditors excused themselves to prepare the formal charges, leaving me alone with the people who once thought they could erase me. The CEO slumped in his chair, disbelief and panic swirling in his eyes. Why would you do this?" he whispered, as if he were the victim. I leaned forward, voice low but sharp enough to cut through steel. "Because you turned integrity into an inconvenience. Because you punished honesty. Because you thought accountability was optional. And because you forgot one simple truth." His eyes lifted, broken and afraid. "Risk is only dangerous when ignored." When I walked out of that building, security badges were already being deactivated, lawyers were flooding the lobby, and the entire boardroom was collapsing into chaos. But I didn't smile. Revenge wasn't supposed to feel good, and it didn't. What I felt instead was something deeper, heavier, more righteous. I wasn't the villain in their downfall. I was the consequence. The city wind hit my face as I stepped outside, the sun breaking through the clouds as if the universe itself approved. My phone buzzed with a message from the federal office: "Formal action approved. Your statement was flawless. Thank you for your service." I slipped the phone into my pocket and kept walking, not looking back, not needing to. The company that once mocked my warnings had just become the cautionary tale I always feared it would. And the man they fired on a stage had returned to build a courtroom of truth around them. Corporate justice wasn't imaginary. It was slow. It was quiet. It was precise. And today, it was mine. The call came the next morning, long before sunrise. I was reviewing a stack of internal documents at my kitchen counter when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number from Washington. I hesitated for a moment, then answered, and the voice on the other end instantly straightened my spine. It was the director of the Federal Regulatory Compliance Bureau, the same institution that had once trained me, the same one whose certification hung framed on my wall. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "we've reviewed the materials you provided. I believe you already know what's coming." By noon, the announcement hit every major financial news network in the country. My former employer, the same company that fired me in front of an audience like I was some malfunctioning stage prop, was now the subject of a full-scale federal investigation. Violations. Non-disclosure breaches. Asset misrepresentation. Risk manipulation. The words flashed across screens like a litany of sins, each one more damning than the last. But the final blow, that one was mine. The Bureau released a report stating that the company's systemic integrity failures were repeatedly flagged by compliance officers whose recommendations were ignored and who were subsequently retaliated against. They didn't print my name, but everyone in the industry knew exactly who that meant. That evening, I watched the news from my living room as the anchor announced the immediate freezing of several executive accounts. My former CEO's face flashed across the screen, not confident and smug the way it had been when he publicly fired me, but pale, sweating, and cornered by federal agents outside the building. As cameras swarmed him, he muttered something about misunderstandings and compliance being too cautious, but it didn't matter. The narrative had shifted. The empire he built on shortcuts and arrogance was collapsing, and it was collapsing in the one place he feared most, in public. But the true twist came the next day, during the emergency shareholder meeting. I hadn't planned on attending, but then came an invitation from the Bureau itself. Your presence would be appropriate. When I stepped into the massive conference hall, the room fell unnaturally silent. Former colleagues looked at me like they were seeing a ghost, or justice in human form. I walked down the aisle calmly, like a man who finally had nothing left to fear. At the front sat the acting chairwoman, a federal appointee brought in to stabilize the company. She nodded toward me respectfully. "Mr. Rourke," she said into the microphone, "your analysis was instrumental in uncovering structural failures that might otherwise have gone undetected. As of this moment, the board recognizes you as the primary architect of the Bureau's corrective framework." Gasps rippled through the room. The same executives who once dismissed my warnings now looked at me with something between awe and dread. Then came the part none of them saw coming. The chairwoman continued, "In accordance with federal remediation protocol, we are appointing an interim oversight committee. Mr. Samuel Rourke has been selected as its head." My former CEO, now stripped of title, authority, and the illusion of invincibility, stared at me, horrified. His lips parted, but no words came out. He just sank back into his seat like the weight of everything finally crushed him. I didn't smirk. I didn't gloat. I simply stepped forward, adjusted the microphone, and in a steady, unwavering voice said the only thing I had waited months to say: "Had you listened the first time, none of this would have happened." And with that, the room bowed its head, not to me, but to truth, finally given the floor it deserved. In the years that followed, people would still whisper about that day, the day a company tried to shame a man who was built from the very laws they thought they could outrun. I didn't need to return to their building or remind them of what they lost. The federal reports, the sanctions, the restructuring requirements, the public statements of deep regret, they all told the story for me. Eventually, new leadership took over, younger and wiser, and the company slowly rebuilt itself with compliance as its backbone instead of its afterthought. Ironically, the very frameworks they used to save themselves were the same ones I had once begged them to follow. I didn't feel triumph watching them struggle, I felt clarity. Because sometimes the only way to teach a lesson is to let the consequences arrive on schedule. My career, on the other hand, didn't just recover, it evolved. I became the person companies called not just to fix problems, but to prevent disasters. My testimony shaped 2 federal amendments, my models became required training, and my name, the name they once tried to drag across a conference room floor, became synonymous with corporate integrity. I traveled, lectured, taught, but more importantly, I learned. I learned that justice doesn't always roar, sometimes it arrives quietly, with documentation, timestamps, and signatures. Sometimes revenge isn't a strike, it's a standard. On the quiet anniversary of my termination, I found myself walking past my old building. The lobby had been redesigned, the colors updated, the old executive plaques replaced with new ones. It looked cleaner, calmer, as if someone had finally opened the windows and let the air change. I stood at the glass doors for a moment, not as a ghost of the past, but as a reminder of what accountability can build. And then, without stepping inside, I turned away. My work there had been completed long ago. As I headed down the block, a younger employee hurried past me, badge around his neck. Just before entering the building, he paused and said, "Hey, aren't you the guy from the federal case? The one who rebuilt the system?" I smiled. "I suppose I am." He nodded with a mix of awe and gratitude I didn't expect. "My job exists because of your rules. Thank you." And just like that, he disappeared inside. I walked on, feeling the weight of everything, the humiliation, the fight, the truth, the victory, settle into something lighter, almost peaceful. My revenge had never been about destroying them. It had been about restoring what was right. And in the end, that restoration had reached farther than any punishment ever could. Justice had been served, thoroughly, quietly, irrevocably. And the man they fired publicly? He became the reason they finally learned how to survive.